By way of introduction, my name's Kati Price. I head up Experience and Digital at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And by way of visual description, I am a middle-aged white female wearing glasses with a brown top. So today we're going to be unpacking some of the ways that AI tools and technologies are supporting creative and cultural practice, from digitising collections to creating playful interactive experiences, both online and in our buildings. We'll be exploring how artists and creatives are increasingly adopting AI to innovate new forms of cultural engagement. Now, we know that any discussion of AI can be quite polarizing, so we'll be covering some of the creative and ethical considerations in the practical undertaking of this kind of work. But we want to focus more on the opportunities for cultural organisations in reimagining audience engagement in the future. Now, many of you will be familiar with the British Council report that was published earlier this year, back in July, I think. It was called Why Technology Needs Artists, and it highlighted how artists are using, and indeed have always used, technology, and how technology in turn is shaped by artists and art, from telling stories that really generate new breakthroughs to diversifying AI data sets. Artists are continually reimagining what technologies can be and who they can be for. So today I'm joined by three brilliant panelists. Kay Watson, who heads up Arts and Technologies at the Serpentine Galleries. Dr. Rianna Walcott, Assistant Professor of Communication at the University of Maryland and Associate Director of the Black Communication and Technology Lab. And John White, Chief Operating Officer at the Space. So I'm now going to hand over to our speakers to introduce themselves. And I've asked them each to give us a short take on what exactly we mean by AI in this context and their perspectives on what the opportunities are for artist-led AI and cultural engagement. So can I go to you first, Kay, to introduce yourself and share some thoughts?
Hi, everyone. My name is Kay. As you know, I'm a white woman with short brown hair and I'm wearing a grey fluffy jumper. I'm sat in front of a bright window and it's a very nice day in London today. I lead the Art and Technology programme at Serpentine in London. So that means I oversee all of our work across commissioning, production, and our strategic R&D and innovation work. We can talk more about that later. So I work with artists, academics, policymakers, technologists, and anyone else really in our field of art and technology on projects, prototypes, and research. It's worth adding that we are not a collecting institution, we're a charity. Without a collection, we have an archive, a very new archive actually. So I may not have so many insights on the collecting institutional side of things. And so in terms of talking about context, what I initially wanted to do was sort of acknowledge the different interrelated elements of what we call AI, and not to think of it as a singular or homogeneous technology. So we're talking about data sets, software elements, which are models, applications, and protocols, and hardware elements like server networks, computation, and data centers, and natural resources that are all working together to build these systems that do things such as learning, problem solving, identifying patterns, reasoning. And each of those layers, or what you might call the tech stack, has represents different technological, political, social, and economic opportunities and challenges. So without meaning to overcomplicate things, but I think it's quite easy to get lost talking about AI in this very abstract way. And in terms of cultural engagement, To me, speaking to the report that you've just mentioned and a few reports that we've released in the past around a program called Future Art Ecosystems, to me, it's interesting to think about where artists in the cultural field more broadly can intervene in the development of technologies and tech systems at different levels of the stack that I mentioned. Um, Rather than thinking about the technology as something that happens to us, and thinking about the kind of impact we as a field, as a sector, can have in its development and adoption. Now, obviously, this isn't that straightforward, nor is it easy. And nor do I think that it means that everyone has to become an expert in this area, but I think it's interesting to think about how we think about the ecosystem and the collective endeavor as a field when we're talking about that. So I hope that's a useful introduction.
Brilliant. Great scene setting. Thank you, Kay. And Rianna, over to you.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Rianna Walcott, and I'm wearing a grey dress with I'm a black woman, young-ish, yeah. I'm wearing some glasses and a grey dress with gold jewelry on. I'm in the US currently, and it is early-ish. So apologies right away for how how early it is to be speaking about AI and scary things. So I work at the University of Maryland, and a lot of my research has more recently turned towards thinking about AI, but specifically our effective responses to AI usage. Things like how does, as an audience, how does as a user, we use and think about some of these technologies in ways that are both embedded into our normal everyday practices, but also how tech that isn't built with particularly marginalized communities in mind. And it was really helpful. Kate already outlined some of the absences of users in the design processes of some of these technologies that we'll be talking about. So I think that part of my work is thinking about how, in spite of it not necessarily being user-friendly or designed with our accessibility in mind, some of these marginalized groups are still able to use tech in such a way that bends it to purpose. So thinking about how that has been done historically, but also how that's happening in contemporary moments. I largely focus on work and with LLMs and chatbots, but I'm also interested in some of the different applications of it in research and artistic applications, thinking about some of the ethical issues with tech not being something that happens to us, but who is left out in its designs and how we work from institution all the way through to individual in our use of it. So yes, meaning by AI in this context, for me, a lot of the time thinking about LLMs, its application in sort of poetry and research and art in that way, but also how it's embedded in different softwares like with 3D modeling, for instance, and creating VR exhibitions and AI usage in those spaces. Also with generating human figures and like responses, like being able to engage as an audience member with an interactive figure that's trained on or is supposed to in some way like represent or speak for another existing person. Like what are some of the like tangly issues that we get into with that? So I think that is probably enough of a perspective set on like where I'm coming from at this. So thanks.
Absolutely, Rianna. Thank you so much. And it's great to hear you talking so much about audience there as well and setting the scene. And hopefully all the words you've used are meaningful to people. So acronyms like LLMs. If they're not, please drop into chat and we will do our best to answer some of the questions for clarification now. And we also will have a Q&A session after a brief break after our conversation here. So come prepared with lots of questions, but in the meantime, for clarification, do use chat. Last but not least, John.
Thank you very much, Kati. Lovely to be here, everyone, and looking forward to the conversation. My name is John. I'm Chief Operating Officer at The Space. I'm a white, middle-aged man, short brown hair, short beard, round glasses, and I'm sporting a white fluffy jumper because it's also cold down here in Southampton. My role at The Space covers, as you might expect, our sort of systems and processes. I get involved quite a lot in designing and applying for funding for different programs we might want to run. So I'm thinking about how AI sort of weaves into that stuff. I led on our response to the government consultation on AI and copyright back in February this year. And I just have a general curiosity around this sort of technology and policy and how it's playing out kind of internationally and the wider sort of cultural changes we might be experiencing and both now and with increasing acceleration in the future. So that's the sort of perspective I bring to it. And I'm quite a visual thinker, so I tend with these complex things to try and come up with simple visual models as my frame of reference. And when I'm thinking about AI in cultural projects, I think about a sort of triangle, and that any project can exist anywhere in that triangular space. And the sort of dimensions of that triangle, the points are, first of all, AI is a tool. So thinking about how AI tools might help a cultural creative project, and that can be anything from sort of very behind the scenes automation of quite traditional production and editing processes, so cleaning up photographs or images or thinking about script ideas, through to more full-scale use of AI, where it might be generating whole video segments or soundtracks. So it's really integral to the creative process. So a project may use it as a tool to a greater or lesser extent, or not at all. And then there's AI as an experience. So where you've got that mediation between the audience or the visitor to an installation and the creative experience, AI is great at sort of widening and increasing the speed and the sophistication of that dialogue. So the experience responds to audience feedback, or it generates new content from audience contributions, or sort of evolves dynamically in some way. And AI opens up all sorts of possibilities for doing that, which have been there in previous technology generations, but are just there more so and more complicatedly now. And then the third apex of the triangle is around AI as a theme. So that's thinking about how artists and creatives are responding to the impact of this technology on society, the new provocations or challenges it's representing. So you can imagine a project that's centered on AI in its theme, but doesn't necessarily make use of AI as technology, or something that sits across all three of those things. And I think that opens up the kind of opportunities you might expect. So again, I often find it's useful to think about comparisons with previous technology evolutions and platform shifts. And I think what's going on in AI in terms of a tool is similar to what happened in game development, which is some of my background, about 10 years ago, where you had the Unity tool set or the creation of the App Store that suddenly democratized and widened who could create games and what sort of costs and scales and the quality of the finished results you could produce. And AI does that sort of manifold, in that you can create very sophisticated end product with much smaller resource inputs in terms of artists and creative time and technology. That is both a threat, and also in terms of employment and representation and copyright and control. Sorry, it's both an opportunity, and then in terms of those things, it's a threat. So there's trade-offs there around AI as a tool. With experience, it gives us all of what I've just talked about in terms of that creative palette, if you like, of creating more immersive or responsive experiences. At the minute, there's that element of novelty and doing things with AI that people may not have realized were possible, and that, can create a very compelling and fresh experience. So that's certainly in the mix as well. And then with themes, as artists and creative always has done, it's about challenging what's going on in society, what the trends are, what the risks are, and I think it provides ample canvas for doing that. So I think there's lots to get excited about there, as well as the complexity that Kay referred to in that technology stack. When we're thinking about tools, they are many and incredibly varied and complex. In a nutshell, lots to get our teeth into and lots of good stuff, as well as the challenges.
Brilliant. Thank you, John, and thank you, the rest of the panel. I'd like to focus on the opportunities to start with, and I'd love to hear from you what you which site is your favorite examples of how creatives, artists and other creatives are using AI as part of their practice, but that's really resulted in some deepened cultural engagement? Who would like to respond?
Would you like me to start?
Go for it,
Kate. So, I mean, full disclosure, we discussed this before, but I thought it might be useful to start with one of our artist-led projects from last year, which was a project that became a kind of, it was an R&D project. It was a commission and production, and resulted in lots of different outputs, but including an exhibition with some artists, technologists, musicians called Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst. And I think it's a useful one to talk about because it was very much a collaborative project between us as a team and the artists rather than a straightforward commission. And it sought also to look at AI in relation to sound and music, something which I think, you know, with sort of the initial sort of explosion of particularly of image making models and now image and video making models, think much more sort of perhaps a lot more visibility in the art context on the visual element of it, even though of course ChatGPT changed everything. But I think it's also quite interesting to think about it in these other creative ways that are not always about generating images or generating other forms of content in that way. So to try and cut a very long story short, the aim of the project was to um, uh, look at each stage and think about each stage of the development of an AI system or series of systems as art making, and to engage the public in different ways at different stages of the AI production. So as part of that, there was also a technical provocation, which was Holly and Matt, as artists and musicians, had been releasing music and developed a project called Holly Plus, which was a synthetic voice of hers that came with a governance system, but it was her own voice. What would it mean if we were to try and produce and develop a polyphonic choral AI model? And then if we were to do that, what would be the right, by which I mean sort of ethical and an empowered governance framework, and for those who would contribute their data to the project? So we worked, the Holly and Matt developed what they called a songbook. It was based on the UK choral tradition of sacred harp, using AI in the composition of a series of hymns and songs. We undertook a choral AI training tour where we worked with 15 professional and amateur choirs to record their voices for the development of this model. But as part of that, we undertook an experiment called the Choral AI Data Trust Experiment. And every choir member was involved in deciding the final data governance structure, including their data rights, their legal rights around the ongoing use of both the data and the model that was then trained. In the context of the exhibition that was created at Serpentine, we wanted to create an experience that anyone could walk in off the street and enjoy and have a beautiful experience. And you know, it's not a didactic, was not a didactic experience. Very much about, if you like, an immersive audio-led experience. And the artists ended up using this data set together with their back catalogue of their music material to develop a new kind of a new model that was generating new music. Now, I'll kind of stop there. There are different elements to it. We've ended up releasing a white paper about the governance structure. And it was very important that we we're able to kind of overlap these different kinds of experiences and outputs and impacts and through this single project.
Brilliant, Kay. John, do you have any examples that you'd like to share?
Yeah, sure. I can put a couple in, but I'd also just like to say, I'd really encourage people to check out the call and the white paper, because I just think it's a fascinating project in coming at AI from all those different dimensions that Kay's described, and governance in particular. It sort of points its way to how you could ethically run these kind of projects and ethically and in a self-contained way train a data set and make that available. And you can begin to think about possible ways that that could then be exploited in a way that everyone involved in the project felt comfortable and had given permission to. So I think it's fascinating both on the creative side, but also on that governance side. A couple of examples for me that are more, if you like, simple and sort of self-contained in what they're trying to do. So the first is one of our commissions, vocalized by an artist collective called Indigo Storm. And that is a project that launched last year, and it's in-person interactive experience or immersive experience. It's going around festivals where people can go and be trained as voiceover artists and led through that process by a clone of Stephen Fry. Originally, when they first conceived the project, it was a sort of AI generated sort of anonymous kind of person, if you like, taking you through that. And then great for them that Stephen Fry, who has a particular interest in AI, agreed to get involved and sort of front it, which has given them some nice media profile. But yeah, the audience member, the visitor, gets encouraged to train up as a voiceover artist, and that's using AI technology to deliver the experience. But then there's a twist in the tale. I won't give the twist away, which gets you thinking about the issues around AI. So that's been a really interesting project to observe and how that engages people with the opportunities and the challenges. And then the second example, also a sort of in-person experience, is a company in the Netherlands called Smartphone Orchestra, and they have a range of mobile phone and other sort of technology projects that they take out to live events. You can hire them to come to your venue and deliver an experience. And one called Ancestors, which uses AI to explore ideas of hereditary. It's AI facial processing, gets you to connect with other people in the room and think about challenges sort of 6 generations into the future, what society might be facing, what your shared sort of long-term responsibility is for that. And it's AI is in the mix of those challenges, but it's not the only thing that the project's thinking about. It's thinking about climate change, society in general, and so on. But it's just a fascinating way of using AI to get people to interact with strangers in a sort of semi-randomized process that unfolds as you go through the event. So those are relatively light touch in terms of their technical sophistication, but I just think it's interesting how they open up conversations about things. I'm not being slightly devil's advocate here. I'm not convinced that AI is particularly different at deepening cultural engagement compared to any other technology like VR or anything else. I think it's just part of the range of things. It definitely opens up a much wider set of challenges around speed, complexity, ethics. But I think if you look at it just as a tool for cultural engagement, to be crude, it's probably worth thinking about it as not massively dissimilar from other technology tools. That's my personal take.
Absolutely, and it's interesting to hear your responses around how, with these examples, in some, the AI element is absolutely explicit and at the heart of it, and at others, not just a tool, a mechanism. I have an example myself, but I might save it for Q&A around a data commission that we did for V&AE Storehouse. But I'll come back to that if there's time, because I'm conscious, as Kay alluded to, we have done some prep in advance of this panel. We have a lot of questions, and they're all really, really interesting that I'd like to push on with. So it's great to hear so much about the audience and the audience responses and involvement, in fact, in some cases, in this sort of work. But before we focus more on audience, I'd like to look at the institution, I guess, the types of institutions, organizations that are sponsoring, commissioning, originating this sort of work in tandem with creatives. What do you panelists think about what that means for the institution itself? So if we're talking about the front end being the audience experience, what about the back end? What does that mean for organizations in doing this kind of work? And John, you've touched on some of the both the challenges and opportunities inherent in working with AI technologies. Maybe Rianna, it would be great to hear your thoughts on the sort of institutional back end.
I'm not sure I'm the best person to go first on that one, but I think I guess from where I am currently, I'm definitely noticing a lot more calls for funding circling around AI. The institutional support for its use is massive, particularly in the university, which has become obviously quite it's a very contentious thing. We're all very it's polarizing, really. Like, you know, we're at once encouraging its usage in like across disciplines and in teaching and in research, but also, you know, quite scared about what that means for us, scared about like the politics of citation and extraction, and of course, like conversations that we'll get to about, you know, the ethics of like what powers that industry. But I think what the mixed messaging of it is that we're at once encouraged to use it, but also to avoid its usage or protect against its usage. So that's my like where I sort of enter that part. I think in the active adoption by creative artists as well is one of the things that I'm thinking about a lot, is the function creep and how inevitable it has become, that it's embedded in many of our tools. So thinking about the fact that at this point, if you want to use a smartphone, you're not really able to escape that. And that is not much different to many other forms of like new technologies as well. So not trying to be like sort of scaremongery about it. Like at this point, you know, it's very difficult to use a brick phone and access all kinds of different services and so on. Like, how is that it's not that different from like now how ubiquitous the QR code is in the institution. But I think that it does take us towards somewhere, because it means that we maybe have to address or be attendant to where funding comes from, how you access it, especially if we're thinking about from the large institutional funding, the large grants that might sort of dictate like the sort of outputs that we're looking at, the cultural fabric, where we're moving towards, but also independent artists and where they might go. So I think that it's just, yeah, that's where I'm interested in at the moment, like how the types of art and the types of research that we make is in some way influenced by the push from our institution to embed it. You're able to, even just like as a small example, I am an affiliate faculty member of the Artificial Intelligence Institute at University of Maryland, and the amount of like hiring power that organization has, or we have now at UMD a proprietary chatbot called Terp AI. Our mascot is a turtle, go Terps and everything. So like, you know, like we are at once telling us that we need to be wary and critical in our engagement of AI, but then also there's lots of, you get course releases, there's lots of support for consciously embedding it in your classes and teaching and so on. So just thinking about the institution in that way.
Yeah. Thank you, Rianna. And I think obviously your context is a very different kind of institution than a cultural institution, but we obviously have similar funding concerns working in the UK context and cultural organisations. And I think you've touched there on literacy as well, and different understandings and uses of AI. John and Kay, from your perspectives, what do you think the implications are of working with creatives and AI for the institution? I'm imagining digital literacy and understanding is one. Funding is obviously where that funding comes from, is another. But it'd be great to get your perspectives, Kay.
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned all the things really, which is we're obviously, I would say, still in the hype cycle, and the hype cycle does impact the funding, particularly if we're seeking funding from private sources, but also obviously this government is putting a huge amount of energy and funding behind AI development and the AI opportunities plan, and so it will have an ongoing impact. And I also agree that I think sometimes with these things, it's often where a variety of different technological innovations emerging with with other forms of other applications where we see great change. So it's not necessarily just like AI is going to do this. It's like AI, 5G, X, Y, Z, all of these things in the way that like the iPhone brought and like Internet of Things brought these like huge changes to the way that we operate in society. Anyway, I mean, this is such a huge topic. Um, and I think there is a lot of pressure. There's a huge narrative around what's the word that I'm looking for? Around the potential of automation to streamline operations, which is often, maybe that's possible. Sometimes it's nonsense. But there's a lot of sort of investment going into that kind of area, which filters, of course, across society. Now, from my perspective, I think the most important thing is really your mission as an institution and what your public mission is and what you are aiming to do for your various audiences and your publics. And by audiences, I mean artists, who, anybody who has any kind of stake or engagement with an institution. So I'm also a bit like, why at this point are you engaging with this technology? Does it enable you to do the thing that you need to do? Or does it, but also it's sometimes it's just like it comes with funding. So this is what we have to do. We're all sort of working in a capitalist reality in the end. For us, what I've always found very interesting is the fact that our engagement with R&D, on the R&D and experimentation side, the creative side, impacts our institutional operations. So not every institution is able to do that, but the fact that we as a team embed ourselves in these, working with these technologies, and we've been doing it for 10 years. So, doing these AI projects have not come out of nowhere. A lot of them have been several years in the making. And it's important for us that then in turn has impacts operational change within the institution, but can also impact others' operational change. We don't expect everyone to be able to do the kinds of projects that we do. And this is, this is what we see as part of our mission as a public institution. And so obviously there are lots of things that are going to become more important, from things like what AI policies are institutions going to have. I think that is going to be important, because how we deal with copyright and IP, when the internet is changing massively and people are not necessarily accessing things through websites anymore. So if you're accessing any information about an institution or an artist or whatever through a large language model, through ChatGPT or whatever, without meaning to advertise for a tech company, but what does that mean for how we as institutions operate? In addition to that kind of back end, what does it mean to put images online as open access images when the website's being trawled? So there's a lot around copyright, IP, ownership, licensing, thinking that is happening and needs to happen and needs to roll out, and there needs to be consensus around. Sorry, I'll stop talking now.
No, do not apologise. You've raised loads of interesting threads there that we will come back to. particularly around copyright, etc. And I think this you touched on sort of productivity tools there as well. I think we in framing this session, we were conscious that AI covers lots of areas, and what we weren't going to focus on so much is, the business transformation side. And I guess when I'm thinking about the institution and the organization and what it means, it's really framed around what that means in terms of doing the kind of work that involves working with artists to engage with the public. And it, of course, does involve all kinds of issues around ethics, etc. And there is a duty, a response from institutions and organizations to really think about AI assisted technologies in terms of the ethics of those. And that touches on all kinds of areas, including creative rights, Kay. But I'm wondering, Rianna, just to get your perspectives, what are you... there's obviously ethical implications covering, all forms of extraction, whether that's from people or from the planet. I'd love to get some of your thoughts around the ethics of this sort of work.
Yes. So when it comes to the ethics of it, I think there's so many different parts to this, like from the beginning of the back end part, you mentioned the extraction, even the large size of the data centers and heating up the planet, etc. We have, obviously, we have to acknowledge that we're in a moment where climate colonialism and issues where different parts of the world are disproportionately suffering the impacts of our increasing hunger for more power and more computational, or like more speed and tech development. So that's part of the ethical issue at the beginning. But one of the something that ties together the ethical issues in terms of citation on the output side of things with some of the different perspectives I've heard from different artists who work with AI in this moment. So there's a couple colleagues that in a shout out here there, I've worked with Stephanie Dinkins, who works with AI art, and in particular has a piece about where it's a multi-generational memoir from her own family. And this actually powered a book that we co-wrote about chatbots and AI and techno-skepticism and our perspectives as like marginalized communities engaging with technology. So the piece is like an evolving intellect AI chatbot where it's designed and trained on data from her own family. And also the work of Lillian Yvonne Bertram, who has published an AI generated chat book recently called A Black Story May Contain Sensitive Content, and also works with inputs from poets like Gwendolyn Brooks. And so the reason I bring that up is because both of those artists are thinking about the inputs that inform AI's voice when it comes to the kind of generation of models, because I think that is one of these sort of key ethical sticky issues here. We're thinking about citation and about ownership of the outputs, but in order to get to that point, we have to think about the inputs that informed the like generating power here. So if I'm asking ChatGPT a question, it's not understanding and it's not processing and having a conversation with me like we're having a conversation where it's understanding. It's basically 1,000 monkeys with 1,000 typewriters that has enough inputs that allows for it to put together a sentence in roughly the right order. But that means that because it's trained on such a massive amount of data, it becomes really interesting when you get artists who are fine-tuning or training their own models to create art, because then you start thinking about, well, if this is me containing controlling the input so that the output is mine or the output is relevant, or and particularly in this case of these two artists is reflective of a specific community that I want to talk about, if that is informing the voice and allows it to become, in this sense, become or be read as like Black or as Black woman, how does that kind of like cultural aspect, like how large does it have to be coherent, and how are the communities that are informing the big ones that we all use potentially being exploited or surveilled or being folded into these products without their own consent or knowledge. So that's the issue, and how some of these artists are grappling with it, that I think is really interesting, because it ties together the sort of the issues of what goes in to make this out, to make this come out, and how does that how does that belong to me or not? You know, are we working with this as a tool, or is this a co-conspirator? Is it a collaborator in the production of art or not? So I think and I know that answer kind of does speak specifically to a lot of the chatbot kind of conversation, but I think it's relevant.
Absolutely. We're going to have a break in 4 minutes, but John, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share around the sort of ethics, but particularly around ownership and citation?
Yeah, I think it's it's interesting to me that, you know, the call out I referenced, the government call out earlier in the year, was around the copyright issue, and just been recently thinking that that is the dilemma around ownership, as Rianna says, around the sort of representation in there, and especially if it's being used on a sort of universal scale for generalizable outputs, rather than focusing on a particular community, in which case having a more closed representation makes complete sense and is artistic voice and creative intent, etc. So there's issues around that, but actually I don't think the solutions sit around copyright and necessarily around citation, just at scale at any rate. The issue is around remuneration and reward, and how this becomes a sustainable model. And the solutions to that probably come from much bigger sort of economic and media and other forces than the UK cultural sector, sort of narrowly defined, just because we don't have the weight to shift those conversations. So we then have to think about how we respond in an interim and rapidly evolving situation. And if I could come back to the sort of governance piece on the institutional side, I think the key lesson is, you know, if you are supporting and encouraging and curating these kind of experiments, which we should be doing, in my view, then first of all, you're trying to create a culture of sort of safe and iterative experimentation and supporting artists and getting them to think about the issues. And secondly, you're probably having to be more agile in governance than you're used to being. So this is not a stable, you know, GDPR kind of data protection kind of environment where you know what the legislation says, you know broadly what the issues are, you come up with your policy, you share it with the staff, and then you sit on it and review it in 2 years' time. This is something where the market and the tools are evolving faster than policy can possibly evolve. So you have to then be in dialogue, be understanding what's happening, be responding, trying to put the guardrails in place, but allowing people to explore and experiment. And that's a much trickier balance to strike. We're not talking about operational practice and process, but I will put a couple of links to resources in the chat that are very good at thinking about if you're developing policy in this area of process. The Arts Council's done some work. There's a very good talk by a guy called Mike Keating at Art Fund that takes you through the practicalities and the steps of thinking about this stuff. Obviously, what we're talking about here is a kind of subset around the cultural and creative use of tools, but the wider thing and the process is really interesting to look at.
And that's really, really interesting, John. I think it's great that when we were talking about convening this panel, we were thinking, you know, we want to leave you with practical tools and ideas, but recognizing that things like policies, etc., are constantly changing. So I think anything we can share with the audience to give them some help in this constantly evolving space would be brilliant. We ended the last segment talking about how organizations, institutions are grappling with things, ethical considerations, and particularly issues around ownership and citation, and what that might mean for some of our internal processes. I guess that sets the scene for thinking about museums, cultural organizations, galleries, etc., as hosts for experimentation and artist-led innovation. And lots of organizations have decades, histories of doing this sort of work. And more recently, it's involved the likes of AI and other technologies. I'd love to know more from your perspectives, what you think makes for being a good host to do this kind of work. Kay, let's start with you.
Hi, good question. It's actually a section of our last report, Future Art Ecosystems 5, Art and Creative R&D around institutions of hosts of experimental work with art and technology. And I think it's quite easy to get stuck on talking about the policy side of things, and there are some incredible institutions in the UK and beyond doing incredible things with artists working in this field, from Somerset House and Mediale and Fact and loads of other like much smaller, more art form specific organizations in the UK. And then really interesting organizations like Onyx in New York and New Ink, which runs a kind of artist in residence, not artist in residence, but sort of an artist development program. And I think what is important is access to the knowledge and skills to be able to develop. I'm very keen on enabling sort of early stage experimentation that does not necessarily come with the necessity for outputs, but we need to have those outputs for the engagement. But I think to really have the opportunity to play and to understand what this stuff is doing requires a bit more of that experimentation. And that is difficult because that is often not funded, or fundable. And there is a move to try and maybe it's more recognized in the academic and policy fields as something that is necessary. And there is definitely a movement within the field, I would say, at the moment. There's been a report. There's our report, Future Ecosystems. There's the British Council's report. There is the Arts Council releasing a report on inclusive innovation. The National Theatre released a report this week on R&D and innovation in performing arts. There is like a move to recognize that sort of mode of experimentation and to find mechanisms by way that institutions can enable more support. That doesn't just mean you freelancers, artists are not on a stable income, go away and learn this stuff. Like, how can we create a much more supportive environment for that to happen? So that's important for me. And also, I would say, depending on how deep you're going into it, is different kinds of skill sets. I think production is one of the least valued skill sets in the artistic sector. I think we're much more focused on talking about the curatorial, and production when you're working with these technologies is absolutely vital. And keen to see much more understanding and focus on those kinds of different skill sets as well, and how they work together with existing roles and institutions.
Interesting. So being a good host is about creating a space for experimentation, and many of the examples you've given, the sort of, as I said, decades long histories and experience in creating that place for experitation. And
I haven't talked about audience though.
we can come on to audience. We're good to come on to audience, but I'm wondering, John, from your perspective, what makes for a good host for experimentation from an organizational perspective?
I think it's echoing a lot of what Kay's just said, and to add to that, which you already alluded to, it's that kind of peer networking. It's often, for us in enabling digital projects, it is those production partnerships. You've got someone who's got a creative idea and doesn't necessarily have the skills to do all of the implementation around that. And I think that's just magnified in AI in terms of it's not a mature technology, and there's a lot more sort of support and hand holding often needed to realize a vision around that. So I think the more that organizations can do that and get people together in rooms having those conversations and just de-risking what they're experimenting with, then the better. that sort of light touch, but sort of supportive governance and oversight to make sure people are thinking through some of the implications that they might not have thought around, algorithmic bias or whatever it might be, that there's a little bit of a safety check going on when this product, this experience goes out into the public. What might happen? What might we need to think about? What risks do we need to protect about? So as with anyone sort of hosting it, stepping back and thinking what might go wrong at the party, and how do you make sure everyone's having the most fun and getting the most out of the experience. But yeah, I'm not sure that's hugely different, other than scale and complexity, from what we do with other kind of hosting of technology and innovation. It's the same sort of principles that apply.
Absolutely. And you remind me of a moment at a conference last week where informally I was talking to someone around their work, and it did involve all the complexities, as you say, Kay, of production. And I do agree. It's surprisingly undervalued and under-recognized often. But I was able to put her in touch. She had a rights issue with people I know, and one of those people was inside the V&A, and it just struck me that I feel the role of conferences and networks and face-to-face contact and sharing expertise, linking people up, because I think ultimately we are all finding our way through this. We're all learning things. I think it's incumbent on bigger organizations such as the one I work at to share that knowledge and expertise where we have it, but also feel, that we're asking similar questions to organizations of very different sizes and scales to our own. But that ability to ask questions, where to go for help, I think is really important, John. So I was wondering, we did touch on this in the first segment around guardrails. Are there set guardrails for innovating, using AI, working with creatives to forge cultural engagement, or are the guardrails different for different types of projects one might be working on, or are there some fundamentals there we should be thinking about in terms of some of the guardrails? Rianna?
Yeah, just thinking very broadly about some of this is one of the things that I noted recently is the UK and EU has, as John mentioned earlier, some policies, things like that we're familiar with, stuff like GDPR in terms of data protection regulations. A lot of other places, like the place that I'm in, doesn't have, there is no equivalent. There's, I think it's more like state by state. California, for instance, has CDPR, but there's a lot of ways that some of our data and so on isn't protected. That means that more recently, the UK and EU, again, also has very stringent sort of AI policies. There's a lot of development of some tools that hasn't quite reached across because, again, of some of those policies that are in place currently. But those are looking like they are on the cusp of being rolled back quite significantly, purely because it means that we in the UK are now falling behind in the sort of AI race for tech development. So I think there's something to be said for how we think about when we are making decisions on a personal to institutional level about the kinds of ethics and policies that we follow. We have to think about the different places that we are engaging, maybe taking our work or thinking about, and then the varying policies that they might have from country to country. There is, because of the speed of the development as well, there's a lot of ways that the policy has no way to have caught up at this point. And the thing that I'm thinking about here in particular is the, back to the citation aspect, right? If there are some lawsuits that have been successful in terms of folks whose books were made part of these models without their consent within a certain time period are able to recoup some compensation, right? But then that sort of brings to mind the question is is the compensation what we're cool with? That's fine, as long as is that what then makes it ethical for us? The extraction of work to inform a data set is cool as long as you're compensated or known, or it's known to you. But then also the sheer size of those types of data sets as well means that it's not really even. I had this perspective yesterday from Lillian von Bertram, who said she's not actually that bothered about her work being in that, because to her it was because LLMs are not comprehending or anything. It means that the outputs of it is just, she's like, it's zeros and ones. It's a massive amount of a data set. So it doesn't mean anything more to me than if someone had checked a book of mine out of the library type thing, and that informs their work, or if their work is inspired by my output in some other way, and then they, so it was a perspective that I wasn't familiar with in that sense. But I think it's interesting to think about how, like, contextually people might have different feelings about the directions that we take at this point, from the individual interaction with some of these tools all the way up to the institutional, and thinking about country to country responses. There's no like real way that we can think about guardrails for innovation or policy that's going to be inclusive enough to account for all of those variants. So like, I think we have to think about whose responsibility it actually is to create our own decisions on how we operate from here.
That's super interesting. John, Kay, what are your thoughts on guardrails? Do they exist? Can they exist? Should they exist?
I think, as Rianna says, it's fascinating that very, very broadly speaking, as she describes, you've got a fragmented approach in the States that is very focused on the tech agenda and what those tech companies, with their very strong alignment to the Trump administration, are trying to achieve. You've got the EU on the other end of the scale with the EU AI Act, which is trying to centralize the regulation. And then you've got the UK sitting in the middle, and our government trying to steer, there's 11,500 responses to that copyright consultation, and they split, as you might expect them to do, between the tech guys wanting deregulation and the artists and cultural, content creators wanting regulation, and our government in the course of the next 12 months or so has got to work out what legislative changes to make to try and navigate that. And meanwhile, to a large extent, outside of GDPR and other established things, we're left to navigate our own ethical landscape and work out what works for us around the environmental issues, the bias issues, the other things we've touched on today. So there aren't sort of standardized guardrails out there, but there are people thinking collectively. And I think what we can do to streamline our approaches is compare notes as a sector, look at the risks we're identifying, look at how we're trying to come up with practical policies and solutions between us, and then share those, rather than everybody sitting there tearing their, in my case, reducing amounts of hair out, trying to solve these things ourselves, because by the time we've had that thought process, things would have moved on anyway. So I think, yeah, that's the challenge, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, there are just so many things to think about, in addition to, operating our institutions, or having an artistic practice, or looking after your children, or whatever it is that you're doing. There are so many things, and I agree that there needs to be a sectoral position and approach and process for dealing with this. And I think this is not just AI, but as we talked about, some of the things fall across different forms of technologies and how they're being developed. So, we know that the UK also has other technology priority areas like quantum, and we don't know what's going to happen with quantum. And, the computational potential of quantum could have enormous ramifications. So yes, I do think this like ongoing, we're never going to solve it because it will always change. So there has to be this ongoing dialogue around things, from that sort of is also embedded with the values and the structures of how organizations or others are operating in the first place. So it's, anyone will go into any project looking at the different ethical considerations of doing that project. And it's no different, but there are things that, from doing the projects we've done, there are things that we would never have thought of. that have happened or are happening. And we want, if those things come up, we want to be able to say to our colleagues across the sector, like, oh, here's this thing that we never thought would happen. Like it just like, and I think one of the things that maybe we haven't mentioned is this difference between like proprietary and non-proprietary platforms. I think there is a big difference. We've talked a bit, it's interesting how ChatGPT has become like the Google now, it's like regardless of what AI model you're using, you say um and what those mean in your context. So in many ways, sometimes it is also difficult to separate the kind of creative practical with the operational practical because of those concerns. Anyway, John.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on that proprietary point because there's something really interesting I've learned in the course of researching for this conversation, which is that 40% of the large language models that have been publicly released have been generated in China. And China has a very specific government policy, part of its AI Plus plan, of releasing open source large language models and other things at different tiers and different strategies regionally and nationally, compared to America, which, as we just mentioned, is all about this the big tech companies trying to monetize the opportunity, very broadly speaking. And so you've got this risk on the one hand that we all end up gravitating towards a few central models that control are the only ones that are viable to be trained and continue evolving. And everything we're doing AI-wise is mediated through this very centralized sort of tech bro approach versus this open source approach. So how does that cascade down to what we might be doing? I just think it's looking at where you can open source what you're doing or you want to, so everybody's benefiting and you're spreading the insight and the skills and the expertise. And then the counterbalance is obviously where you're trying to protect IP and the artist's unique creative contribution. So it's striking a balance between those two things. But the more we can widen access to this technology and reduce the centralization of control, the better. And just incredibly ironic that one of the world's largest centralized economies is doing the opposite of what the US is doing. I didn't realize that.
It's utterly fascinating. And I want to come back to a thought that I think you touched on in your intro, Kay, which is the sense that technology can feel like something's just happening to us. And I think as far as our audience is concerned, that probably is a lot of what the sentiment shared by many people, even if it's not necessarily the case. And certainly artists and organizations might have a different perspective. We've talked a lot about audience and not to see it in sort of monolithic terms, but I'm really interested in hearing more from you around to what extent, and you gave an example, Kay, of where the audience has not just been involved in discussions around AI, but in the very sort of contributing towards an AI-powered experience. To what extent do you think we should be involving our audience, if not in the creation, but certainly in discussions around AI and its impact, particularly on the creative economy? John?
Apologies, I was completely distracted there by a fascinating question in the chat. So could you ask me that again, Kati, and I'll give you an answer.
Mike, and I should also be keeping an eye on questions because we're going to be coming on to questions in a few minutes' time, and I will do so.
Sean, I will answer your question in a few minutes' time, and now I'll try and answer Kati's question, if you wouldn't mind again, Kati.
Yes, I'd love to hear from all of you, to what extent you think we should involve our audiences in discussions around AI, which, after all, is a very polarizing debate.
I mean, my take on this again is artists are always involving audiences. Well, not always, but most art is some kind of dialogue in some way between an artist and the audience, and it's focusing on, through the lens of the artist's perspective, it's getting the audience to think, and that audience feedback and engagement, what works they choose to engage with, is part of how the art then evolves and develops and does or doesn't reach more or less people. So I don't know from the role of us, say, as a commissioning organisation, or other host organisations. I'm not sure we should be doing much more than stepping back and letting the artists choose their themes and their provocations, and seeing how the audiences respond. And the thing we're always trying to do at the space is encouraging artists to think and focus on the audience and how they're going to reach them and what the story is they're trying to tell, and putting the technology second. So aside from that very generalizable sort of thing that we would be encouraging them to do, I again don't know that AI is different from anything else in terms of giving space to creatives to do what they do best and getting out of the way as much as possible.
And Kate, I'm wondering if John's saying leave that to the artists as part of their practice, as they've been doing for a long time. Doesn't that expect a lot of the artists to do a lot of the heavy lifting? And let's face it, there's a lot of education that's needed around the world of AI, and so they're carrying a lot, I guess. Is that a reasonable expectation if it is a desired outcome that we do start provocating and generating discussions?
I mean, I think it depends on I think there are different roles to play in the ecosystem of that is art and culture. And yes, I don't disagree with what John is saying. I think it's, especially if as a commissioning organization and an organization that supports other organizations to develop in terms of policies and stuff like that. Yes. I think the audience is inherently involved. And I would consider our role, when we're working on these projects, we're always considering all the different audiences that we are interacting with. So whether that is a collaboration with the technology potentially a collaboration with the technology sector, and aiming to sort of demonstrate the responsible or inclusive forms of ways of approaching a project. It's all about this like dialogue about how about the development of what these technologies are doing. I guess we are also a space with an exhibition program, and when we work with artists, we are the organization that creates the bridge between something becoming public and being experienced. So that becomes inherent or becomes part of the production process, because there is going to be an outcome. And we're also thinking about the specialist audiences that we engage with as well. I am always reluctant to put too much pressure on artists to solve technology. I am agreeing with the sort of sentiment that tech needs artists. I think tech needs the cultural field. I don't think it's just about artists. I think it's about a variety of different roles and people doing things in support of that. In the same way that artists can't solve the climate crisis as well, but we can create space for convening, we can create space for conversation, we can create space for stories, and we can create different kinds of community space. And those spaces don't always exist anymore. And I think that's important.
And I think that is a brilliant note on which to end our conversation, or at least pause it to make way for some questions and answers from the panel. So I have got some of the questions that were posed in the chat. And John, you were distracted by one that was clearly a good one. So do you want to share what that question was and your answer, if you have it?
Just because it happened to touch. So Sean asked a question about whether have people looked at bot blockers for stopping models getting access to work going forward. And again, it just happened to touch on something that I learned very recently, which is back in the summer, Cloudflare implemented an enhancement to how it does bot blocking for its customers. Many of you may not have heard of Cloudflare, or might have only have heard of it in the context of bits of the internet occasionally falling over, but they provide a sort of protection layer that sits across about 20% of the global web content, which corresponds, I was just looking it up, to 6 trillion data requests per day. So an eye-watering amount. And when they implement a technology change, which is basically allowing their customers, who are a lot of big media organizations as well as small organizations, to more easily stop their content being crawled by these AI bots, then that makes a big shift in the landscape and what's going on. And I suspect that's the model we're moving towards. And where Cloudflare is going to it is then beginning to look at what a monetization mechanism might be around that. So increasingly, the guys who are training these large language models and other AI are going to have to start paying for the content. And I think it's at that global level, frankly, that some of the solutions to this are going to start coming through. There's things we can do around making sure we behave ethically, but these really big picture universal solutions are going to come at the very large scale end of the tech infrastructure. And I'll just put a link to that news article in the chat. Someone's got there before me.
Can I just add to that? One of my colleagues actually in the team has been doing some research on how cultural organizations are options for this and different tools, including, as you say, Jesse, in the chat around like the need for paywalls and all this kind of stuff. We're hoping, I don't want to sully his research by getting it all wrong, because it's very early days, but it's something that we would like to share at some point in the future, because it's quite interesting, because he's done a bit of an audit of how different kinds of organizations are setting up these attempting to set up different systems to block crawlers.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to not share my screen. I'm going to go back to the chat. There was a question much earlier on in the conversation from Nicola at Fact, and it was a very long question, but I'm just going to focus on the end part of it, which was, how do we close the gap between the computational ambitions of serious artistic practice and the institutional frameworks that currently reserve high-performance computing for commercial and scientific applications? Are cultural organisations essentially being locked out of the very technologies we're critically examining? Kay.
A great question.
It is.
Nicola, very good question. I mean, yes, there is a lot of power being held by certain organizations to be able to offer free access to compute. And that often comes with, an artist or whoever having a certain kind of, sorry, I have a real problem with finding words at the moment because I am very pregnant. Apologies. Reputation, and being well known. Sorry, that's the best way I can say it. So there is this kind of gatekeeping of compute happening. Now, there's been discussion, I don't know whether it's real or not, about what does it mean to have like cultural compute capacity and this kind of thing. I think it's really tricky because the whole kind of policy discussion is very siloed. So DSIT, the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, very much holds the AI sort of hold the AI project, which is very siloed from the Department for Culture, Media and Sport and this kind of thing. So there's not, as I see it, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not seeing a huge kind of consideration across these different kinds of fields. And I think it also connects a little bit. So that's the kind of compute side. And actually, I saw a question before about ethical and responsible uses. And of course, some uses of AI are not as huge when it comes to compute, if you see what I mean, because you're using quite bespoke small data sets to do certain work. So it really depends on the scale of the kind of project that's being undertaken and the kind of resources that I need. But yes, I agree with you, Nicola, that there is a kind of blockage and barrier.
Thank you, Kay. We've got lots of questions, but I'm going to focus on the ones that are more open-ended rather than there are lots of requests for signposting to things. I'm looking to the space team. Hopefully you can provide necessary links into the chat. That would be brilliant. But there was a question here about, from an artist perspective, for artists who are curious about integrating AI into their practice, where would you suggest they begin? And what are the most effective ways to stay informed about opportunities such as call-outs, residencies, or AI-focused commissions that can support and expand their work in this direction? John, do you want to have a go at that one?
I'm going to be very space promoting and say Angela, who's lurking in the background on this call, does an excellent little news update periodically on funding opportunities across the board. So we keep our eye out for these sorts of things and we'll promote them. So do go to our website and sign up for that. I think the other general thing, as with all tech, is just play around with stuff, experiment yourself. A lot of these models are free and openly available. The tools, they're changing all the time. So search, try stuff, and then reach out and ask others in your networks and it's that same way. Just get curious and try stuff. It's not as scary as it looks, but it's also, it is an enormous landscape. And so it very much depends on what you're trying to do. But just digging around tends to yield lots of interesting stuff, as with many things in life.
Thank you, John. Any other thoughts from the panelists on where an artist might begin or see where there might be funding opportunities?
You go.
Yeah, I was just saying, I'm on like a million mailing lists, so I'm gonna I'll dig up some and pop them in the chat, or send them on later.
Great, Rianna, thank you.
And I think it's also worth looking at different organisations that are specialising in this area. So as I mentioned before, like FACT, and Nicola has been asked that very good question, who are off, and Somerset House, who are often creating different kinds of opportunities and sharing lots of interesting developments in the space, especially when it comes down to art and culture. And yeah, there are loads of the space and these other kinds of entities who are focusing on this area as well. Some interesting mail outs, and it's sometimes worth looking, because obviously there's us in the sort of the art field, but then there's also the creative industries, and there's whilst we sort of overlap and sort of don't, there are opportunities and information emerging from these things. I could mention CoStar, which is much more on the screen-based technologies side of things, but the sort of creative industry space is also showing quite a lot of that kind of practical information about these kinds of things as well.
Yeah, and just to add, the immersive arts program, which in terms of funding opportunities is coming towards the end, that's a 3-year program, but that includes in that immersive term sort of AI tech as well. And I wouldn't surprise me if there wasn't a sort of future iteration of that. That's a project supported by AHRC and at least 3, if not all 4 of the UK arts councils. So that's been a major initiative in that space.
Sorry, I'm trying to keep an eye on questions in the chat and make sure I haven't missed any.
Can I just say I agree, Maitri? Not to say custom models are the only way, but I agree.
Yeah, and I just agree as well. As a self-contained way of learning kind of the ecosystem, then custom models is a good way to go. There was a question earlier about environmental impacts.
Yes, that was the one I was trying to hunt for. And what are the tools for tracking any energy usage and climate impact of this?
And again, I was curious. So I think the environmental impacts are at scale, and I was curious whether the impacts are more sitting around the training of models or around the utilization of models. And the answer is the training is increasingly a very energy intensive thing as the models are getting more and more sophisticated and large scale. But on the lifetime of a model, the impact is on usage, but it's obviously on usage in aggregate, which is billions of inference requests going in. So people asking chatbot questions or trying to get the model to do some task for them. And so we are all of us only going to be a tiny fraction of that usage. So it's analogous, I think, to the broader climate change picture and what you do with your own behavior. You might choose to drive an electric car or do other things to modify your usage, use these tools less. There isn't, because I suspect because it's commercially sensitive, but there isn't sort of readily available comparison data on which of these models is more or less energy efficient. The only thing to say is it's a very strong economic incentive if you're training these models to make them as energy efficient as possible, because one of the major costs you're dealing with is the energy cost. So they're all motivated to try and drive that cost down, but it's hard to find information unless someone has found it and put it in the chat right now, Rianna. But as far as I can tell, there's no sort of standardized benchmarking that can tell you which is the greenest tool to use, which is also the same in terms of environmental sustainability and kind of hosting and all sorts of other things. When we're looking at the environmental footprint of doing a digital project, the theories are there. Everyone knows broadly what good practice looks like. When you start to get into specifics, it sort of dissolves somewhat into generic advice, but no one can give you real concrete, use that hosting provider because they're 10 times better than this hosting provider. So yeah, that's probably not a very helpful answer, but it's complicated is the too long didn't read.
Thank you so much, John. And thank you so much to our brilliant panelists. I think we've heard about some really interesting innovations and work that artists, creatives, and cultural organizations have led with the help of many other folk who work in this space. But it's been really fascinating to hear some more about the approaches people are taking for AI technologies to generate cultural engagement. And we've also touched importantly on some of the ethical and practical considerations too. Hopefully we've left you with some ideas for next steps if you're interested in doing more in this space. And I just want to finish by saying thank you, panelists, and thank you to everyone watching for some brilliant questions and lots of interesting debate.